Welcome to the Awakening Together channel here on YouTube. This is our Awakening Together weekly gathering. Each and every week we have a different minister who speaks. If you would like to attend our services live, please visit our website, awakening-together.org. Click on Online Sanctuary on the main menu, then How to Enter the Sanctuary. Our services are held Sundays at 10:15 a.m. Eastern Time.
All right. Hey, everyone. Happy morning. Good to see you. Welcome to this Sunday's weekly gathering. Not yet the last Sunday in July. Is that correct? We still have one more. So, okay. So we're moving right along, but we still have a whole week of July left. That's nice. So today's weekly gathering is called What is Self-Realization? And what we're going to look at today is a definition of self-realization. We're going to talk a little bit about the experience of self-realization, and then I guess a little bit about how to become self-realized. So I want to share with you a statement of purpose. The statement of purpose is one of our core values. And for those of you who don't know, once upon a time, we designed what our weekly gathering would be like. And I know over time, people don't know the purpose of every element of the weekly gathering. But the statement of purpose is intended to be the statement of purpose for today's weekly gathering. And it comes from either our shared organizational purpose or from one of our 5 core values. That way, we're making sure that our weekly gathering is always aligned with our organizational purpose or one of our 5 core values. So that's the reason we share a statement of purpose. So the statement of purpose that I selected today is core value number 3. We accept one true self, which is one presence or being, non-dual, without beginning or end, and absolutely changeless. I'll read that again because today's homily is called What is Self-Realization? And really, it's answered by the first line in this core value. We accept one true self, which is one presence or being, non-dual, without beginning or end, and absolutely changeless. And then another point that I said we would look at today is how do you become self-realized? Well, the second line of that core value answers that question. And that says, we live this value by practicing letting go of the belief in the individual self as who we are. So again, the purpose of today's weekly gathering, we accept one true self, which is one presence or being, non-dual, without beginning or end, and absolutely changeless. We live this value by practicing letting go of the belief in the individual self as who we are. So, Sign, I think I fulfilled my objectives. I can go home now, right? I already did what I said I was going to do, but I'll stay because I also know the weekly gathering is supposed to last a certain amount of time. Happy birthday to Anne. Today, I think, is the day that she officially is a year older. So happy birthday, Anne. And will also be the reader today. She's celebrating her birthday by being my reader. So thank you very much for that. Next, we're going to shift into the devotional portion of the service, starting with a song. Now, the song is actually a comedy, but I think you'll enjoy it. It has a lot to do with what I'm going to be sharing today. The song is called Self-Awareness. That doesn't sound like a comedy, does it? But it is nicknamed the Enneagram song, and it's by a singer named Andy Gullahorn. So, Sina, if you would play that for us, please. Thank you, Sina. So let's go into our prayer. I want to say thank you for every experience. Every experience has some value. It must, or it could not have been. And yet it also feels important to realize the difference between what has true value and what doesn't. So today we want to focus on what has true value while we let everything else be. Amen. So, as I mentioned, Anne is celebrating her birthday by being my reader. I appreciate that, Anne. She's going to read excerpts from the Teachings of Inner Ramana. So I'm going to turn the mic over to her.
Wonderful. Thank you again. So again, these are excerpts, and I will just let you know which chapter they're from. First chapter is the importance of practice. Much of what you do comes from the ego. Let me define ego for you, since all words can have varying meanings. Ego is the belief in the false identity I. So when I say that much of what you do comes from the ego, I mean that you are being driven or moved by that belief in the mind. That is the same as saying you are listening to and believing thoughts or stories in the mind. And this is belief in illusion. We've already agreed that our purpose now is not to believe the mind. This is what I call non-attachment. Non-attachment is not believing the mind. Complete non-attachment is realization. So if much of what you do comes from attachment or believing the mind, achieving non-attachment must come from doing differently. And this is the purpose of surrender. When you ask me for guidance in the moment, you are giving willingness to detach from ego or the belief in false I and realize true self through non-attachment. To try to understand awakening while the false concept I is in place can be very frightening, because as false I stretches beyond itself to understand what is being taught, it finds it is not there. To the one who defines himself by this false thought, absence of I appears as death. Living without I is the answer to this fear. This is how true perception or guidance becomes a bridge. Some people want to understand awakening before committing themselves fully to it. They want to ensure they can understand that awakening is safe and is not death. But I would ask these ones to ask themselves, who wants to understand awakening? If they make this inquiry, they may discover it is attachment to the false I that wants to feel safe. In this way, to continue to seek spiritual knowledge or understanding is to remain attached to the false concept I. It is much better to use your time in the practice of the mantra and surrender. You will awaken faster through these practices than through asking questions about awakening. This is the chapter from The Importance of Practice, Part 2. Surrender is a practice I will continue to emphasize because it is one of the most helpful of all spiritual practices. One may argue that surrender is not the only path of awakening, but this is more of an emphasis than a truth. The only path of awakening is to deny the false. And the false must be denied completely. Surrender is a means of doing this while still moving about in the world. Without surrender, one may deny the world by withdrawing from it. This is also a path that has worked. The enlightened person who realizes self while still experiencing a body does not experience independence. The belief in independence, or the idea of ego, has died for this one, or he would not be realized. As there is no idea of independence, there is also no idea of deciding for himself. The enlightened one, who lives in a fully realized state, lives and acts, moves and speaks according to a script that is fed to him in the moment. This script comes from the one for the highest purposes of the one. So the enlightened person does not feel separate from the script maker, nor does he feel he is making decisions for himself. He follows in joy and realization. Is it surrender when the enlightened one follows this script? Since there is no other, who would he surrender to? And yet it is following, just as surrender contains the idea to follow. If you follow the practice of mantra and surrender and refrain from, quote, thinking for yourself, unquote, you also refrain from making a script that includes a false concept self. Since this self is only part of the script and not part of reality, ceasing to make it also allows it as an idea to fade. This is part of awakening because this is non-attachment to a false I. Non-attachment to the false lays the way, opens the skies to allow realization to the truth. And the final section is from True Understanding Comes from Seeing. Intellectual questioning and intellectual answers cannot give sight to the blind. You cannot tell a blind man what blue is when the blind man does not know of color. You may tell him of the coolness of blue and compare it to the fiery hotness of red. And although this may give him some idea of the difference of color, it will not answer his question. What is blue? Likewise, I cannot answer your questions regarding the nature of reality. You must choose to see these answers for yourself. But I can tell you about the nature of your blindness, and therefore how to find a cure. When your blindness is healed, you will see. For sight is only natural to an unblinded man. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. I appreciate it. So as I mentioned at the top of the weekly gathering, I have 3 objectives for this weekly gathering. One is to provide a definition of self-realization. Another is to talk about the experience of self-realization. And then the final one is to tell you how you can become self-realized. When I read that this morning, I thought, who in the world would promise that? But then I thought, well, nobody promised it. That's what came out of the pen. I think I'll start with the definition of self-realization. But what I want to say about the definition is, if you listened to my words carefully when I was going over the objectives, I said I'm going to share a definition of self-realization. It's very similar to what the Teachings of Inner Ramana said about the definition of ego. It said, let me define ego for you, since all words can have varying meanings. So in other words, here's what ego means in this context, right? In this teaching. It's the same thing with self-realization. The definition is in a certain context, but another teaching at another time may use the same word to mean something else. So I'm going to give 2 definitions, and then I'll tell you which one I'm talking about today. How's that sound? So one definition of self-realization comes from the Teachings of Inner Ramana, and that's the one that I'll be talking about today. It says, the enlightened person who realizes self while still experiencing a body does not experience independence. It also said in here that, let's see, where was it? Non-attachment. No, that's not it. But anyway, it talked about complete non-attachment to the mind is self-realization. So we're looking at, again, the idea of an enlightened person is self-realized. That's someone who does not experience independence. In fact, it says the belief in independence or the idea of ego has died for this one, or he would not be realized. And then somewhere else in here, it said that non-attachment is not believing the mind, and complete non-attachment, oh, here it is. Non-attachment is not believing the mind. Complete non-attachment is realization. So the definition of self-realization as it's given in the Teachings of Inner Ramana is what I often would call true perception. In other words, there's still the experience of a body. There's still the experience of a mind. There's still the experience of a world, but it is no longer believed like it once was. And that's because the self is realized. It's like I said during the prayer, that which has true value is what's focused on. The self is realized. Realized just means, what does realize mean? Every word that's coming to me to describe it isn't completely perfect. Realize just means that I now see. I now more than understand, experience that this is more real and has more value than the perceptions, the thoughts, the personhood. Now, another definition of self-realization is when what I call the first principle of God is referred to as self. And it's kind of funny because that can also be referred to as non-self. But when that which I call the first principle of God, or the supreme or the absolute, is referred to as the self, then self-realization can be awakening to that. So what's interesting about all of these terms is they can be used at more than one level, right? They, because words are just words. Words point to reality, point to what a person is trying to communicate, but they are not the reality. They are not what is trying to be communicated. And so different words get used at different times. But today, when I refer to self-realization, I'm going to use the definition in the Teachings of Inner Ramana, which means I'm referring to true perception, which I also sometimes call the first awakening. And other times I say it's not awakening at all. Other times I say the only true awakening is the second awakening, the one to the absolute. So all of the words get very confusing. But the interesting thing about self-realization, as it's described in the Teachings of Inner Ramana, is that it's actually easily achievable. And I know that at one point, it doesn't seem like that's true because I remember that point. But I know now that it is easily achievable. And I think anybody who is self-realized would also say that it's easily achievable. No one that's self-realized would ever say that it's difficult or it's hard. In fact, they would use words more like it's natural, it's obvious, right? Which can be frustrating when you feel like you haven't realized it yet. I love the song that I picked out because some of the sentences in the song, although they were comedy, they're very, very good pointers to what the experience of self-realization is like. And so I'm going to share some of these lines with you again and then talk about them. The first line was, always stay the student and never the master. That is the experience of self-realization. The experience of self-realization is not so much awakened, although it's very clear that you see in a way you did not see. It's very clear that you understand and feel in a way you did not understand and feel before. I mean, that is very clear. But awakened has a done sound to it, like something has completed, something has finished. And the experience of self-realization is more like a blossoming, right? It's almost like you saw, understood at one level, and you've kind of moved up to another level. That's undeniable. But then this other level is like this, right? So you're blossoming. There's a continual experience of blossoming. And so there's a continual discovery. And so there's no feeling of being the master. There's the feeling of, you could use the word student. It's not student like before when you were studying, and trying to learn. It's not that kind of student, but it's the discovery, right? The discovery of this experience and this discovery of how this experience is continuing itself, right? It's not like you are continuing it. It's like the experience is continuing itself and you are witnessing it. Now, a lot of these sentences, if they were on a true-false test, I would have written false to. The first sentence, always stay the student and never the master, I would have written true to. That's actually the experience. It's not even a decision, it's the experience. But the second one, I would have written false to. But even some of these false statements I want to talk about because they're good pointers, even though they're false. So one of the sentences in the song was, I feel so alone. That's just not true at all. It's completely the opposite of that. You know, one of the terms that's used to describe it is unity, right? I feel unified with everything, you know, and so that includes, you know, insects, that includes the wind, that includes the leaves on a tree. So the experience is not so much alone, even though it's not separation. It's not me and you, right? But it's also not alone. It's unity. It's, you know, the same as everything, one with everything, completely within everything. And so I feel so alone, you know, I've heard people say that, you know, they don't like the word oneness because it sounds so alone. And that's why I thought it was good to comment on that sentence, because that's not the experience at all, right? Another sentence that he said in the song, which I really love, is, "I'm sure I'm right. If there's one thing that falls away, it's that. I'm sure I'm right." I remember once upon a time sitting around a table with some spiritual, you know, co-spiritual students, and somebody saying something about, you know, when you're awakened, you're like Einstein, you know everything, right? You suddenly just have all of the knowledge available. It's actually exactly the opposite. And of course, I'm talking about true perception here, not the absolute, but it's the experience of realizing you don't know anything. In fact, you are so sure that you don't know anything that you're able to be at peace, right? What people don't realize is what causes upset is thinking you know, thinking you're right. And so when you're so sure that you don't know anything, you're at peace. And like it's perfectly okay to be, quote, proven wrong when you say something and have somebody say, oh, that's not true. Well, it's not a big deal because you weren't attached to what you said anyway, because you don't have any feeling that you're always right. That's gone. You know you don't know. And that's the beauty of it. That's the peace. He says, friends aren't evolved enough to understand. Well, that sentence is a really funny sentence, because there's a partial truth in the sentence and there's a complete misunderstanding or completely wrongness to the sentence. The complete wrongness part is friends aren't evolved enough. You see everyone the same way you see yourself. It's really kind of funny. In fact, when people speak to me in a way that shows that they're clearly believing something that's completely false, I often feel shocked because I forget that people still believe that way. You see people the same as you, and that's natural. Whatever level of seeing you're at, you see everyone and everything the same as that. That's just the way you see. So you would never say friends aren't evolved enough. It's not how you see. In fact, it would be more accurate to say that, I'm going to use the word evolved just because he did. I would never use this word, but I'm using his language. The friends are perfectly evolved, but they're still believing this, right? It's like they are here, but they're still sometimes letting their attention go there. But you would never see your friends as below you, if that makes any sense, or anyone else. But the other part of this sentence, which is true, if we realize the first part of the sentence, friends aren't evolved enough, is untrue. The last part is true. Friends aren't evolved enough to understand. So what you start to realize is that people who don't realize their own realization, because that's how you see it, people who don't realize their own realization see you the same as them. just like you see them the same as you, right? Therefore, because they haven't realized their own realization yet, they cannot understand you. And so that's something that you just start to accept. You start to accept that people see you the same as they see themselves, and that's all they can do, just like all you can do is see them the same as you see yourself, right? That's just the nature of perception. And so it doesn't matter. I remember a story of Krishna with Arjuna traveling, and I may tell the story slightly wrong, but I'll get the gist of it right. Krishna and Arjuna were traveling, and when it came nightfall, they came across this rich man's house. And the rich man, they knocked on the door wanting something to eat and a place to sleep. And the rich man gave them just like the leftovers from his table that he was going to throw out, after he had eaten. Instead of throwing it out, he gave it to them. And he told them they could go sleep in the barn, even though he had plenty of food and all these rooms. And when they were leaving the next morning, Krishna really blessed him, said, may you have, more wealth, may you never suffer, just really blessed him. And Arjuna was shocked because he thought that this guy was really rude to them. He could have given so much more and he didn't, but, he didn't say anything and they walked on. And that night, they came to a house where there was a man that was very, very poor. He had almost nothing. In fact, he didn't even have a bed. He slept on a mat on a floor. But when they asked for something to eat and a place to sleep, he only had one bowl of rice. He gave that to them, and he gave them his mat on the floor. When it came time to leave the next morning, the only thing the man really had that had any value was a cow. He had a cow that he could get milk from every day. And so when it came time to leave the next morning, Krishna said to this man, may your cow die. Now, Arjuna was just, he was pissed off, I think, even though I don't think those words are in the story, because here was this rich man who could have given us anything and he didn't. And you blessed him. And then here's this poor man who gave us everything he had. And the only thing he has of value is a cow. And you said, may your cow die. And what Krishna said to Arjuna was, you cannot understand me. And then he went on to give an explanation that Arjuna could understand. He said that this rich man needed to live many, many more lifetimes before he was ready for awakening. And so, Arjuna was just blessing him in the direction he needs to go. But this poor man only had one attachment left, and that was his cow. And if his cow would die, he would awaken now. But the reason I tell the story is because of the line, you cannot understand me. That becomes an actual experience. You cannot be understood. And so as a result, you cease to try to behave in ways that people will understand and accept. Right? Because they can't. So you just be in the way that's natural and right for you to be in the moment, even if others think you're completely wrong. Just like Krishna, Arjuna thought he was completely wrong, right? The next sentence that was in the song, talked about, I think he said some Easterner or some Greek person, I can't remember what he said, but said, know thyself. And of course, know thyself is the highest purpose we can have. That is the highest purpose. But then he said that person would be jealous of me, which is just kind of funny. Because certain concepts, once you have awakened to true perception, certain concepts no longer have meaning. For example, the word jealous. I mean, it's just not even a word that you would think of. Right? So to say that someone else would be jealous of me, the only way you would use that word is if someone used it, like you might say, well, John said he was jealous of me, right? Then you can report it. But it wouldn't be in your mind that people are jealous of you because that concept has no meaning. Right? The concept itself of being jealous has no meaning. There's so much equality and sameness and perfection in the way you see that you cannot comprehend concepts like jealous. He said he was a man without a shadow. That's another thought that just simply doesn't appear. Once upon a time, I know for a fact that once upon a time in my experience, there were a lot of shadows. I had a lot of beliefs, like deep belief in my unworthiness, all kinds of beliefs. And I do know that those are not a part of this experience. But there would never be a thought there would never be a thought. How can I say this? There would never be a thought that there's not something else to discover. Right? There would never be a thought that there isn't a continuing of discovery, because that's the experience. And when you say there are no shadows, you're saying there's nothing else to discover. There's nothing else to see. So that thought could not occur. I love this one too. And I would have said this once upon a time. I totally get this sentence, but it's not true. He said something about, I got rid of my ego, right? I used to hate it when people say what I'm about to say, so forgive me in advance. There's no ego to get rid of. And that's how it's seen. It goes back to what the Teachings of Inner Ramana said. Much of what you do comes from the ego. Let me define ego for you, since all words can have varying meanings. Ego is the belief in the false identity I. It's a belief, or in other words, it's a thought. So what happens is you transcend a thought, or you see that the thought is no longer true, but there's no ego to get rid of. Does that make sense? And so you would never say, I got rid of my ego. The sentence wouldn't even make sense. You might say, I don't believe the mind. You might even say the mind still chatters, but I don't really give it any attention. You might say that. So it's almost like the connection between, of believing I am the mind is what got broken. The mind isn't even gone. But there's no ego to get rid of. It never existed in the first place. It was merely a belief, merely attention on thought, believing the thought, believing that I and the thought are the same, right? He said, I've reached enlightenment. And it's funny because I noticed that as Anne was reading, even Inner Ramana talks about an enlightened person, but those are just words. Believe it or not, those words even cease to have meaning. So you would never say, I'm enlightened. You know that you see differently than you used to see. You also know there's a continual discovery. And that's it. That's that. Like, that's the end of it. There's no I'm enlightened to it. The word doesn't have meaning anymore. The word has meaning more from the perspective of believing the ego than it does from the perspective of not believing the ego. What it means from the perspective of believing the ego is enlightened then would be having the clarity to not believe the ego anymore. That's what it means, right? Enlightened, listen to the word light in that, having the clarity not to believe the ego anymore. But when you don't believe the ego anymore, when you don't believe the mind, you don't identify with the thoughts, the word has no more meaning. My calling is to lead the lost through the darkness. That is ridiculous. That's ridiculous. You know, there's no such thing really as people who are lost. It's more like somehow the awakening has started in some people and the awakening has not started in some people, but everyone is right where they're supposed to be right now. There's no one lost. Everything is perfect. Also, you know that you can't lead anyone. You know, even though, you know, I can show up and I can speak, any realization that happens in you, any insight that happens in you, happens in you. I can't give it to you. If I happen to say something that kicks off a realization in you, that's because you were primed, you were ripe, you were ready for that realization. I could not make that happen. I can just be available and speak the words. I have no control, no ability to help anyone. So you would never say, my calling is to lead the lost through the darkness. It doesn't make any sense. You also would not say, I know the way. He said, I know the way. He said, I'll text you the website. What I do when I come in and I share is I share my journey. That's all I can do. And I say that over and over and over again if you listen to me, right? I do not know your journey. What I do know is that every journey is completely unique. So what I do know is my journey is not going to be step by step by step the same as your journey. So how can I tell you I know the way? I can share my journey. That's what I can do. I can share my journey. And if there's any part of it that connects with your journey, that will happen within you. But it would be completely wrong for me to tell you that I know the way for you. He says, they say it's a journey, but I found the end. No. There is no end. Right? There is no end. The unfolding never stops. That's why it's called the infinite. So that doesn't make sense either. I found the end. And if you look at it, who would even want an end? Right? There was one sentence, though, that if I understood him correctly, the rest of the sentences were all jokes. But if I understood him correctly, this sentence I could actually say true to when it was in a song. Actually, it's two sentences he said right after each other. One was, I used to not see. I would still say that feels like a true statement. And that will continue to be a true statement. Like as the unfolding happens, there will be a continual, oh, I used to not see this. Oh, I used to not see this way. Oh, like that's the experience, right? So that felt true. I used to not see. Of course, here he's talking about his own experience. He's not talking about others, right? And then he said, I had much more. Now, I don't know if he said I had much more to see or I had much more to me. I'm not sure which one he said, but either way, it's true. If he said I had much more to see, then at any point, you still have unfolding. So that's a very true statement. I had much more to see, right? There was much more to this. But if he said I had previously much more to me, that is also true. Because, you had all of these ideas that you identified with as me. And as you're no longer identified with those ideas, what it feels like is less me, right? So I had much more to me. So those are my comments on the song. And I absolutely love the song. I just thought it was so perfect. Let me see if there's anything I want to comment on in the Teachings of Inner Ramana that I have not yet commented on. Oh, there is, because I have talked about the definition of self-realization. I have talked about, somewhat the experience of self-realization. But the other thing I said I was going to talk about was how to become self-realized, which is funny because I just said I don't know the way. But I'm sharing from my experience, right, from my journey. And this is what is written in the Teachings of Inner Ramana. The only path of awakening is to deny the false, and the false must be denied completely. That's the answer. What we don't know is how denying the false will happen for you, right? But this statement seems to be another true statement. The only path of awakening is to deny the false, and the false must be denied completely. So in some way, what will happen for you is insight will begin to arise that will help you deny or see through or transcend things that you once believed were true that aren't true. So some of the practices that arise that help with this are things like inquiry. In fact, as you know, root cause inquiry was a very, very early thing that arose within me that helped me to start seeing through things I was believing, right? Seeing through the false and then denying the false. Just journaling with inner wisdom, which is another type of inquiry. I would ask inner wisdom questions and I would get answers. There's the practice of self-inquiry. There's the practice of Byron Katie's inquiry, the work, right? There's also the practice of surrender, which was key, because in the practice of surrender, you cease thinking for yourself. Thinking for yourself is believing the thoughts in your mind. So you're letting go of believing the thoughts in your mind, which is non-attachment. And instead, you're just asking what I am to do now. And you are tuning into that feeling of present moment guidance and following that. And so you're detaching from the mind. And remember, complete non-attachment is realization. So surrender, I found very helpful. Nisargadatta talked about, I don't remember his exact words, but what he talked about was how people will have clarity, like in his presence when he was speaking, it would connect within them and they would have clarity, but then they would go back out and basically undo the clarity, by getting in an argument with someone or by doing something that was still believing the old thoughts, still believing the old conditioning. And so if you realize that you can't still believe the old conditioning and be self-realized at the same time, you kind of have an idea of what needs to be done, which goes back to the statement of purpose, the second sentence that said, we live this value by practicing letting go of the belief in the individual self as who we are. So, for example, when I lived with Laurent and our personal values seemed to really conflict, really be opposite, instead of arguing with Laurent and fighting for my personal values, I dropped them one after another, after another, after another, right? It was okay that the house wasn't clean. It was okay that we spent more money than my value system said we should spend. I don't really remember. It was okay that we ate dinner at 10 o'clock at night, because I was dropping the values that I was attached to because I was letting go of the self. So what we can't do is cling to the false as true and have self-realization at the same time. And you can see how that makes sense. Therefore, to reach self-realization in one way or another, in whatever it shows up on your path, what we're doing is we're denying the false, seeing that the false is false, that it's not true. I sometimes call that letting go of self-will. For me, probably the most important part of the spiritual path was what I called first discernment, knowing the difference between ego and inner clarity. And then being surrendered to the inner clarity, regardless of how much the ego kicked and screamed. That was critical for me on my path. And one of my favorite songs in the very beginning of my spiritual path, when I started choosing to listen to inner guidance instead of what appeared to be me, was a song by Scott Kalekstein Grace called Guide Me. And so what we're going to do is we're going to listen to that song. Also, I think Sina will probably share a link. If you want to donate to Awakening Together, you can do that. But this song I listened to maybe hundreds of times because I knew that inner guidance was the way. And the song inspired me and helped me to connect with that inner guidance and follow it. So Sina, if you would play the song. I'm so grateful for that song. It has given me so much. So we have, we only have 2 minutes. Is there a quick comment that anyone wants to make?
Well, I do.
Yeah, Sharon, for somehow I knew it was going to be you. Go ahead.
Well, I started with you in 2007.
Yeah.
And Inner Ramana was my favorite book. When it came out in 2009, Bill Free and Lynn were at your house, and I called Lynn, and we were hysterical laughing because I couldn't find me, but I was not able to get it until now. I live now in a state that there's never been a person. And a while back, somebody said that you had a direct teaching and they didn't know me. And I want to say this. I'm a fan of yours, Regina. You have brought me through self-realization, you and a million teachers. I mean, Bill Free went on to become a great teacher. I can only say, and Laurent was one of my teachers, you know? So I just love you so much. You're such a treasure to everyone. And I remember when you were in that tavern, when you said that, and I said, inside it said, listen to her. So thank you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, my beautiful, beautiful friend.
Thank you. And it was wonderful to come in and see you here. Your name was the first one that popped in my face today. I thought, oh, look, Sharon is here, you know, because.
Well, I'm here a lot. I listen on the radio because I have grandchildren here. Yes. But I walk around with my earbuds because, you know, to me, anybody that's on here is so blessed. If they just listen to the beginning teachings, you have taken us through. I watched people, what they did too. The ego in their minds, you just stayed there and you just took it. You know, I was like, why are they doing this? She's helping us.
Yeah, what she's referring to is in the beginning when I was teaching, there were, you know, lots and lots and lots of negative comments on the board. And so she's like, she says, and I just stayed there. And that's true. That went on for about, I don't know, 2 or 3 years.
Too long.
Yeah, but it all helped me what I always perceive that, even though we don't do that here, I always perceive that as very helpful because it helped me to stay focused with wisdom in spite of, you know, what appeared to be lots and lots of attack right in my face, right? It helped me to say, okay, but this is all I'm paying attention to. So I actually perceived it as helpful. But I know that not everybody perceives it that way, so we don't permit that here in Awakening Together.
And I just want to say one quick thing. Jacqueline and Anne and Rhoda are going to carry this through. They're going to take, and Shauna, they're going to make it go because I wanted this so much because of when it all was birthed to you. I was like, oh, I love Awakening Together. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And then Sina, I know that we're already over, but the next song's only a couple of minutes. Do you think we could play it? This is a song that Scott Kalekstein wrote apparently as he was listening to me tell the story of the Apple experience. And so it's another comedy song. It's called If I Only Had a Brain. So, or only had no brain. That's it. So Sina, if you would play it. Thank you. It's a funny song, but I thought it was a perfect ending to today. So, so thank you. And I'll see you all around. Bye.
Been watching our online gathering. It happens weekly on Sundays at 10:15 a.m. Eastern Time. To join us live in the sanctuary, visit our website, awakening-together.org. You'll want to click on Online Sanctuary in the main menu, and then in the drop-down menu, look for How to Enter the Sanctuary. Right there at the top of the page is a clickable link. We'd love to see you in the sanctuary and join with you in fellowship. Thank you again for watching. Also, please know that if you'd like to stay connected via the Awakening Together channel here on YouTube, you can subscribe and hit the bell for more notifications. We hope to see you in the sanctuary.